Hello, my YouTube fans, our watchers, our random people on YouTube who just happen to found this channel. Although you picked a very weird place to start. Um, we continue our series on Read on Authority by JudgeSabo. And we are going to now go through where he summarizes what he takes as to be the most charitable form of Engels' argument. And part 1 through 5, I go through the beginning of this paper where I go through this charitable stating and also state my own critiques, as well as where I have read Marx and Engels' adjudication with anarchism in the past. I want people to know that, I am theoretically not an anarchist, although I do think the state as such, as a classed organ of armed men, is something that in the long array of history we need to make go away. I do think it's a much longer project than most anarchists do. However, and so does Marx and Engels. Engels here, however, seems to think that authority would be necessary economically, but not politically, in a kind of weird way. And on authority, which has become a favorite on Twitter, I do not understand, because historically we kind of found this to be the embarrassing Engels was pissed off that day three-piece attack on anarchism, as opposed to other implied attacks in the exchanges between Marx and Bakunin. Nonetheless, I think we need to go through this because, in addition to kinds of equivocations and whatnot, I also think it actually sets up bad misunderstandings between Marxist and anarchist. Not that I think that, Marx and anarchist unity is the most pressing thing in the world, but it would be nice if we quit mischaracterizing each other. And also, we should just, as Marxists, admit when one of our key texts is not super great. Anyway, and so on that note, we are now in the argument restated. So JudgeSabo is going to restate what he thinks to be the most charitable form of the argument, cleared up from its polemic and stated as clearly as we can have here, before he launches into responses and a breakdown of those responses. And I'm going to try to engage this as charitably as I can, as someone who tends to come from the Marxist side of things. But, I've been told by my friends at the Regrettable Century and in a few other places that I'm too soft an anarchist. And I clearly don't think that. And in fact, if anything, one of my major concerns these days is getting beyond the debates between the vertical and the horizontalist approaches of politics, because I both think they fail. That neither one of them really deal with our situation in an adroit enough manner. All right, let's get on with the show. The argument restated. Our meticulous analysis of an authority has revealed many points of ambiguity within the essay. Yeah, you saying? We have been able to clarify some of these points by reading them in context of other parts of the essay, understanding the historical context it was written in, and comparing it to similar writings from Engels and Marx. Less so Marx. I do think we need some more Marx in here, but we'll see. Other points still remain ambiguous despite these efforts. Where ambiguities remain, I have attempted to provide several interpretations and argue for the reading that I consider most plausible. And for the most part, I think JudgeSabo has been not just plausible, but charitable. It is possible that someone may be familiar with Marx and Engels' thought could clear these points up more. That's why I'm here, I hope. But more than I have been able to do or could demonstrate flaws in my own interpretation. I believe any errors on my part would be relatively minor or peripheral. So far, I'd agree. The core of Engels' argument is relatively clear. It is generally summarized like this. The anti-authoritarian socialist, aka the autonomist or anarchist, condemn all authority. Engels defines authority as the imposition of the will of another upon ours, subjugating the latter to the former. This definition is meant to be the same sense of what anarchists mean by what they oppose, by when they oppose all authority. Engels believes the anti-authoritarians are wrong for two reasons. People will need authority even within the future socialist society. And two, the workers need to utilize authority within our present capitalist society to achieve socialism. I mean, I do actually kind of think the latter is true. Production tends to be more and more towards the use of complex machinery, which requires many people to coordinate their actions together, i.e., combine to cooperate. With this greater need for combined action comes greater need for organization and administration. This system of administration, no matter what form it takes, exercises authority by imposing certain decisions, such as scheduling. Because of this complex automatic machinery requires this administrative needs by its very nature, the automatic machinery holds a veritable despotism over the workers, independent of all social organizations. All social organizations. Some anarchists have denied that delegates are authorities and instead represent a different kind of social relation, e.g., having a commission entrusted. Engels asserts they are authorities and accuses anarchists of trying to pretend that they are not, like they're not the same by simply applying a new label, being unable to point to any material distinction. Socialism will not abolish all authority, what will confine it to limits made inevitable under conditions of production. Anarchists are correct that socialism will not have political authority of the state, but are entirely wrong about how this comes about, thinking the revolution will start with abolishing the state before destroying the conditions that gave rise to it. I mean, I tend to be sympathetic to Engels on this one part of the argument. But I actually don't get how that point is reconcilable with his point about the despotism of machinery. Anarchists contradict themselves for calling for a revolution, which must necessarily be violent and therefore authoritarian. It's a different definition of authoritarian, although the errors and confusion spread by anarchists hinder the workers' movement, either intentionally or unintentionally, and therefore serve its enemies. Within this, there are several important claims against anarchists are these. Firstly, anarchists oppose all authority, with authority being understood to mean something being imposed. Engels does not elaborate on what something being imposed means, though. From his examples, it seems to be narrower than the broadest interpretation given, where something imposed is simply by the case of being independently free from our will, but is also broader than coercion used to maintain class peerage, including all acts of violence. His interpretation seems closer to the middle interpretation we've examined, where authority exists whenever someone acts to achieve an end which conflicts with someone else's desires. It also simultaneously broader and narrower. It is broader because he also attributes authority to forces of nature and machinery. As we said, that can't be the same kind of thing that he's talking about in his definition. That's an equivocation fallacy, but he nonetheless does it. But it must be also narrower, since if he really does mean that, he could be found less convoluted examples of combined action. A couple deciding what to have for dinner is a form of combined action, far more independent of all social organization than a factory. Secondly, anarchists must oppose administration or coordination and production as a form of authority. It is unclear how far Engels thinks this line of argument could be taken. Does mere advice or recommendations count as authority? Or does it need to be a more formal structure? At the very least, anarchists should not be able to consistently accept the examples Engels cites, since such groups of people voting on agreed upon schedule are assigning a delegate to create one. The consistent point is important, since Engels indicates that anarchists he spoke do not oppose this in practice. The force of his arguments depend on the clarity of definition of authority, its consistency with anarchist uses of the term, and the schedule making delegates is a clear example of a sense of authority anarchists claim to oppose. Thirdly, anarchists must oppose all forms of violence, including those used by oppressed people to resist their oppression, since all violence is authoritarian. Engels seems to really believe that anarchists would need to be pacifists to remain consistent. But even if they do not, they would still need to explain how the definition of authority does not apply. All violence is authoritarian. And I have my own caveats when Engels assumes that the infinite complication of machinery leads to more and more centralization and more factory work, where the opposite has been historically true. Engels is actually weirdly Whiggish on this point and not very dialectical in the proper sense of that term, meaning he does not see how the contradictions of the development of of centralized forces actually decentralizes the workforce over time because you just need less and less people to do the work. And thus you need more and more people servicing the logistics of an increasingly centralized productive capacity, which fragments the workers. Basically, the more work you can concentrate, the more you can reduce socially necessary labor time. There becomes a new contradiction where the massive teams of workers needed to centralize that work in the first place are now largely replaced by automation. But you need to now service the logistics and the social reproduction of life for people for who the goods flow out from, which means that the infinite centralization imagined by Engels is just not relevant. All right. He doesn't see this, even though it's consistent with dialectical thinking. All right. Let us go to the next section, the critique of authority, the critique of on authority. Engels' syllogism. To better focus our critique and to further clarify this interpretation of Engels' argument, it is useful to present it in the simplest possible form. This can be done by presenting his argument as a modus tollens syllogism. So we're using analytical logic. I can already see Marx is freaking out because we're using analytical logic and not dialectical logic. But I'm going to point out that Engels' argument, ironically, is not dialectical here. It just isn't. I mean, it's one of the things that makes this kind of different from the normal Engels-Marx thing, where dialectics really does apply. Engels' polemic here is basically a straightforward argument. One with some equivocations and some weird assumptions, but it's still a straightforward argument. Except when he tries to, as you know, like, oh, the freedom created by centralized production will despotize us all. That's a dialectical move, but it's just a rhetorically dialectical move. It's not substantively dialectical because he doesn't actually prove it. All right. Premise 1. If anarchists are correct, then socialists must reject all authority. If P, then Q. Premise 2. If socialists must not reject all authority, not Q, certain forms of authority are inevitable given the conditions of production and will therefore be necessary in the future society. Workers must also exclude authority in the present to abolish capitalism. Conclusion. Therefore, anarchists are not correct, not P. I will call Engels' syllogism hereon. Any reference to premise 1 and premise 2 without further context are implicitly about the syllogism. Syllogisms can be shown to be either unsound, either by demonstrating at least one of the premises are false, or by showing the argument is invalid. This gives us three basic methods of criticizing on authority. Premise 1 can be false if anarchists do not believe that socialism must reject all authority in the sense that Engels is using the term. It is definitely not hard to find examples of anarchists denouncing all authority, but to interpret this properly, we need to understand the sense in which authority is being denounced. 2. Premise 2 is actually a compound set of premises, which makes this complicated, but I'm going to accept this setup for now. Engels believes that he defined authority in the sense in which the word is used here by anarchists. If this is wrong and his definition is broader than anarchist meaning, including things which anarchists do not condemn, then premise 1 would be false. He would be presenting a clear straw man of anarchism. Premise 2 can be challenged if socialists do not require authority. Determining whether or not this is true or false also depends on the word authority is understood for similar reasons to premise 1. A narrow definition of authority would exclude some things that could be embraced by a broader definition. Once this is established, we can challenge Engels' two primary examples of the necessary authority: combined action and production, and a revolution. The validity of Engels' syllogism can be challenged if Engels is not actually making a modus tollens argument. For example, if the meaning of the word authority is changing between premises 1 and premises 2, which I actually think it is, but we'll come back to that, then he should be suddenly making a false equivocation fallacy, which I have accused him of. For comparison, suppose someone made this argument against Engels. If Engels is correct, then socialism will be a classless society. If P, then Q. Socialism will not be a classless society, not Q. Students will need classes in which to learn things like math, art, music, etc. Therefore, Engels is not correct. Notice this is equivocation between one notion of class and another notion of class. But these are completely unrelated notions, all right? This argument obviously does not challenge Engels' position in any meaningful sense, and would certainly not convince any Marxist because it is equivocating social class with classroom. Yeah, it's just a just a word substitution. To examine whether Engels' syllogism works, we must analyze several questions. 1. How do anarchists understand and critique authority? 2. Do the anarchist critique of authority apply to combined action or machinery? 3. Does anarchist critique of authority apply to violent revolutions? We need to address other issues brought up in our analysis, such as the anarchist view of relations between the state and class conflict, whether anarchists believe the state can be abolished at one stroke, whether anarchists are pacifists, and so on. I mean, I would say the problem is I can find anarchists who believe all of these things, but I do not think all of these things define anarchism, and that's going to be a problem throughout, both in trying to defend anarchists and in condemning them, and that's been a problem when most people discuss anarchists because they're very vague about what they're talking about. Anarchism, even more than Marxism, is a very broad tendency, and Marxism really should be talked about as Marxisms. All right, we're going to stop here. Oh, no, we'll go into one more section. How anarchists talk about authority. Engels defines authority as the imposition of the will of another upon ours. On the other hand, authority presupposes subordination. I have also suggested that we could give this a more universal form as the imposition of will of one party upon another. As we've seen, he expected this definition to be consistent with the anarchist usage. According to him, when anarchists are rejecting the authority, they were rejecting it in this sense. To see whether Engels is accurately describing the anarchist position, we need to examine some anarchists themselves and how they described and critiqued authority. When examining this, we would naturally see them address a number of other related issues regarding administration, production, and the state. We have also seen that Engels has one particular anarchist in mind, Mikhail Bakunin. This is not said directly on authority, but has been made clear in the timing of the essay's writing, coinciding with the split in the First International following the Hague Congress, and was first stated explicitly in Engels' letters to Lafarge and Kuno and the early version of Engels' argument. Special attention should be given to Bakunin's analysis of authority. Still, the fact remains that authority is presented as a critique of anarchism in general, and we should not just look at Bakunin exclusively. I mean, we should also look at Proudhon and maybe even Blanqui, although Blanqui's not an anarchist, but still. By analyzing the thoughts of various anarchists on authority, our hope is to move toward something that might be considered a standard definition of authority compared to against Engels' definition. I mean, I would say a standard definition of authority as defined by anarchists in the 19th century in this debate, because authority and anarchism is a big fucking sticky wicket. I mean, like if you're looking at anarchism throughout history, because there are some anarchists I have met who believe the thing that Engels is critiquing. They tend to be young, but still. Graeber, Brett Noir, the show, the book I'm holding right here, which I've discussed on the Patreon, would not be guilty of what Engels is talking about, actually. Although he is guilty of some other things. The ideas that would become anarchists were developing well prior to this point, of course, but nonetheless, the major limitation of what material can be used, few works exist, and even less have been translated. Yeah, that's a problem. It's a problem even when I've talked about this with Second International Marxism. It's amazing to me how much of the stuff has not been translated and how much of like more obscure later stuff has been translated because of the context of the Cold War. As I've joked many times, sometimes it's easier to find Urdu poetry than a 19th century German explanation of what the SPD was doing. All right. Given these limitations, my analysis here will include not only anarchist works prior to the authorship of an authority, but also other anarchists of the 19th and 20th centuries. Oh, that's a little bit ambitious, buddy. I will begin with the text written prior to October 1872, giving special focus on the writings of Bakunin as the primary author Engels had in mind. Once established, I intend to examine the thoughts of later anarchist writing, demonstrating the continuity of thought, if possible. As a consequence of this approach, this section will be fairly lengthy, quote-heavy, and somewhat repetitive since we are trying to demonstrate the large degree of overlap between thinkers. I also hope that readers who might be unfamiliar with anarchist theory can be exposed to several works in the process. And I'm not going to go into long quotes of Bakunin now, so we're going to stop this here. So far, I've been impressed by the thoroughness of this address. It's much more thorough than mine. We'll see if I actually buy all the explications of the anarchists. This might be where there's more friction between me and JudgeSabo. We will see. I do not know. I have become slightly more sympathetic to Bakunin as I've gotten older, although with some glaring faults in his personality and history to be noted. That does not, however, damn his theory. There's plenty of bad shit about Marx and Engels too, particularly Marx. Engels, weirdly, might have done a few things I don't like, but was at least a gentleman asshole. Anyway, on that note, we'll end for today.